Okay. Now I've started recording, I think. Is that right?
Recording.
Yes.
Apologies, we've started with recording.
Cool.
But we will make the slides available.
Okay. So I asked people to use the chat to just define what you think the scholarship of teaching and learning is. So let's have a little look at what everyone says. So Maya says, evaluating student learning in response to certain teaching strategies. Nice. Elizabeth, engaging in current best practice for teaching, in this case, archaeology and anthropology, but researching and publishing on pedagogy. And Kelly does SoTL, but it's not official. So you have to do research, teaching and service. That's really interesting. Karina says researching, understanding, teaching and learning, including how we do it. Penny says it goes beyond just reflecting on teaching and students to reading and researching more widely. Akash says research on how we teach and learn. And for Sam, it's understanding how students learn and how to innovate regarding teaching and learning. That's really lovely. That's a real breadth, it feels like, of different sort of reflections on what scholarship of teaching and learning is. And that is the reason that I asked you to put what you think it is, because it's one of those concepts that's quite broad and it means different things to different people, as your sort of definitions all show. So I'm going to give you a little potted history of SoTL because I find it really hard not to give a potted history of things as an archaeologist in general. I'll try not to be very dull about it though. I think it's quite interesting because I think the thing is that there's a general uncertainty about what SoTL really is, and I'll come back to that in a bit. But when it was first proposed, the first time that SoTL was proposed, it was by a chap called Ernest Boyer in 1990. He was I think the president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and he set out a kind of re-analysis of the priorities of the professoriate, he said. And he said that anyone in academia should be doing a series of things. They should be doing a scholarship of discovery, so like creating new knowledge, doing research. They should do a scholarship of integration. That should be sort of bringing your new knowledge into the world and to other people. A scholarship of application, so should look at how your ideas are applied in practice. And a scholarship of teaching, how we teach all of those other kind of things. And he proposed that this should be like a really integrated model, that none of these kind of scholarships stood on their own. They all fed into one another. They were all something that everyone in academia should be doing. And that in 1990, I think, was probably an easy thing to propose, because academia in 1990 was quite a different beast to what it is now. In the UK, the numbers of students have grown exponentially as a result of government policy. And across the world, higher education has grown, numbers of students in higher education have grown quite substantially. And so when Boyer proposed this, higher education was still a kind of smaller thing, and the kind of cleaving apart of things like research and teaching that we've seen hadn't quite happened. So this lovely integrated model fits. It's lovely. The scholarship of teaching fits in with everything else, and everyone should be doing this integrated stuff all the time. Now, you notice it just says scholarship of teaching. It became scholarship of teaching and learning, SoTL, in about a decade later. So then a person called Shulman wrote Fostering a Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, and Hutchings and Shulman wrote The Scholarship of Teaching, New Elaborations, New Developments. And they took Boyer's scholarship of teaching category and they set it apart on its own. They disaggregated it from that integrated model and they added the word and learning so that it became the scholarship of teaching and learning, and the scholarship of teaching and learning was born. And they said scholarship of teaching and learning has three characteristics. It's something that is public, that's public facing, that you do and then you share with other people. It's something that's not just available. You don't just go, oh, I did this thing, but it's something that peers can critically critically review, and it's something that other people can build on. So they said it's generative, it can be exchanged. And I really like this quote: SoTL requires a kind of going meta in which teachers frame and systematically investigate questions related to student learning, the conditions under which it occurs, what it looks like, how to deepen it, and so forth, and do so with an eye not only on improving their own classroom, but advancing practice beyond it. And so they really framed SoTL as the thing that anyone who teaches and learns needs to advance teaching and learning. And so it's a benefit for everyone. It's a benefit for anyone who is teaching and this is in a higher education context, and anyone who's learning. And so it's a really nice and thoughtful approach to what we should be doing to advance teaching, to make it more than just a kind of chalk and talk model, to speak to the needs of our students in all sorts of different ways. And over time, people have done bits and bobs of work to refine that. And I particularly like the DART model, the dimensions of activities related to teaching. It turns out that people in SoTL love a model, and if you can have a pretty picture, it advances your SoTL no end, and people share it repeatedly. So what they did with this was they captured that way that that Shulman and Hutchings had talked about SoTL being systematic, about it being public facing, and they created these axes that demonstrate that. So you can see the different dimensions of teaching. So if you're teaching some stuff, developing a course, developing a lesson, actually teaching it, that's the practice of teaching. If you're doing that and you're reading about it and being informed by it, that's scholarly teaching. If you're sharing what you've done with people, I did this, there you go, then that's sharing about teaching. But if you're taking your teaching, you're making it the subject of your inquiry, so you're analysing stuff. So for example, you could take, they put curriculum design here under practice of teaching. But what if you design a new curriculum, right? And to do that, you read through all the different things. You want to bring in all sorts of amazing principles like universal design for learning to inform your assessment. You want to make this a really accessible curriculum. You want to make it a curriculum that fits with the latest teaching in your subject and the latest thinking about teaching and learning. You embed some digital learning, kind of some flipped classrooms, all those funky things, and you do all the research around that and embed them in your curriculum. And then you teach that curriculum, and then you ask your students to feed back about it, and you evaluate it, and you compare how they felt compared to how they felt before, probably with an angle like, did they feel that it was more inclusive than what had previously been offered, and so on. And then you take that to a conference, or you write a blog about it, or you write an academic paper about it, and you present it into the world. I did this curriculum design, and then someone else says, oh, that's fantastic, I think I might use that. And someone else says, well, that's an interesting thing, but I would change it here, there, and everywhere. That is the scholarship of teaching and learning, right? So anything that is systematically done, that involves that kind of scholarship and understanding of the sort of intellectual context in which it's in, that evaluates what you've done, that puts it out into the public, that's the scholarship of teaching and learning. And I think this DART model is really helpful, and I'm using it in the work that we're doing at Manchester, because I think it's a really helpful way of defining the scholarship of teaching and learning. But there's always a but with these kind of things. So although we've got these lovely models of what teaching and learning looks like, of what scholarship of teaching and learning looks like, and that DART model is from 2015, so it's less than 10 years old, so it's pretty recent. There is a growing body of literature of people who said, yeah, but hang on, what really even is SoTL? And there's a whole load of people who did studies starting with a advanced HE, that's formerly the Higher Education Academy, review in 2016, but there's papers actually going all the way back to 2011, excuse me, where people have talked through why they think SoTL has become a bit kind of disaggregated. That when Boyer proposed the scholarship of teaching. He was thinking about it in this kind of integrated way. But as our teaching and learning practice has become part of an increasingly disaggregated neoliberal higher education landscape, excuse me, SoTL has become something slightly different. So so this is a really nice, helpful chart by Canning and Masika, which it comes from a paper that they wrote called The Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, SoTL, the thorn in the flesh of education research. You can tell they're not mega fans just from the title of their paper. So they propose that there's two types of SoTL. Now, normally, like when you're talking about web development, like Web 2.0 is better than Web 1.0. Not in this case. For them, SoTL 1.0 reflects a kind of more pure SoTL. So something that does exactly as we've just talked about. It follows that kind of DART model, that original view that Boyer and Schulman and Kern et al. Have all talked about, and that it's sort of very clearly defined. It sort of looks at lots of different philosophies and is influenced by them. It's disseminated publicly and so on, and it builds on previous scholarship. It's really important that it does all of those things, and it contributes to original knowledge as a result. Whereas they see that over the sort of last couple of decades, this kind of disaggregation of higher education that sort of has shoved teaching in a little bit of a box in order to prioritize research and give research a kind of primary sort of importance, means that people have become more vague about what SoTL is. That people have said, for example, that things like reflective practice on its own, so quite private things can constitute SoTL. That the development of institutional policy that isn't available to the public and isn't available for critical analysis, and that doesn't advance teaching beyond that kind of institutional area, that can be SoTL. And so all of these kind of broader views of SoTL, they class as SoTL 2.0. They're basically philosophically untheorized, they're very management-led, they might innovate, but they don't disseminate, and they build on the needs of the institution or the individual. So really, they're basically saying SoTL 1.0 is good, and SoTL 2.0 is this kind of horrible neoliberal vision of what it is to do teaching and learning, that the core of real SoTL has been hijacked by evil neoliberalism. That's not quite what they say. It's a much more balanced argument. And that feeds into their argument, which contributes to a whole range of other papers who say, well, this kind of SoTL 2.0 view, this view where that's pretty much anything anyone does in teaching and learning in higher education can be viewed as scholarship, devalues our pedagogic research, and it devalues our proper sort of pure form of scholarship. And in the UK, certainly, and for those of you who are joining the recording, we forgot to press record at the start. So I defined the research excellence framework, which is the sort of way that research is measured in the UK. And there's been all sorts of tensions in that, because the predominance of the ref means that teaching's already undervalued compared to research. And these various different papers have argued that this kind of perpetuating this kind of neoliberal, corporate, managerially driven view of SoTL makes research into teaching seem even more wishy-washy. No one really knows what it is. It's really wishy-washy. It could be anything, and it definitely can't be refable. And they say, well, that really undermines what we're doing, because we're doing proper pedagogic research, we're doing proper educational research, and that's being undermined by this broad view of SoTL. And Canning and Masika argue that we should just get rid of the term SoTL altogether, that should just go, and that we should, and there's a whole series of papers about why, by people like Tierney, about why SoTL should be part of the ref. Anyway, it might be, but that's a completely different, confusing additional level. The next ref is going to take a sort of broader view of what can be included, and so people on teaching focus contracts might be able to be included in the ref, but it's not, my understanding is it's not quite been confirmed yet, and institutional policies that respond to it haven't yet been confirmed. And anyway, all of that doesn't matter, because people on teaching and scholarship contracts don't tend to have research in their contract. So I put this in here to remind me. Karina and I wrote this book. We mentioned this at the start, Assembling Archaeology. And the kind of thing that we're arguing sort of articulates with some of these arguments about the value of pedagogic research, not necessarily SoTL versus pedagogic research, but the arguments that say that we need to recognise the research into teaching and learning as being just as important as all other research areas, and indeed taking a kind of integrated view, right back to like Boyer's integrated view. If we can take that kind of thing in the way we think about teaching and learning and how we sort of inform it with research and how it informs research, that then we are able to kind of undercut this kind of disaggregated neoliberal view of higher education. That's what we've argued anyway. But the bottom line is that I produced that book without having research in my contract. And that is the thing that now, personally, like I'm grappling with that at the University of Manchester, because it's all good and well saying, if we put SoTL in a box, it undermines, and we say SoTL is a thing, it undermines proper pedagogic research. It's all good and well saying that. But the bottom line is that 36% of people in the UK, and similar kind of proportions in places like Canada and Australia, are on education focused contracts which don't have any research in them, but they do have scholarship in them. And I think what's more helpful then, particularly for people like me and people who I'm supporting at my institution, is that we take a view of SoTL that is much broader, and that has, but not in that horrible kind of sort of neoliberal sort of managerial creeping manner, but more in a way that recognises that SoTL is nuanced, that it happens on a spectrum. There are things that are the scholarship of teaching and learning, like doing some reflection on your own teaching that's informed by some literature, and then making some changes to what you've done, and then going and teaching that to students. That is a form of scholarship of teaching and learning, but it's quite a sort of small amount of that. If you then evaluate that and put it out there, share it with your colleagues, and you're taking it right out into the public, it becomes really clear SoTL. But so you've got sort of on the one end sort of relatively kind of like private forms of scholarship of teaching and learning that aren't necessarily disseminated beyond your own learning context. On the far end of that spectrum, you've got full-blown educational research and pedagogic research. So if we sort of view SoTL or scholarship of teaching and learning as a sort of spectrum, then but we keep in those kind of core principles of it being systematic, of it being public and evaluated and so on, then I think we allow people's context to come into the idea of SoTL a lot more. And that means that we sort of move to this more toward this nuanced view of SoTL. And there's some really nice publications that talk about things like the variety in SoTL as not a problem to be solved, but a source of possibility. So the International Society of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning say a strength of SoTL is that its practitioners ask many different types of questions, drawing from many scholarly traditions to build toward a more comprehensive understanding of how teaching and learning happen in a range of contexts. So that idea of sort of the SoTL that you do can be really contextual, and that brings a really positive diversity to it. So I think that's something that that I really like that. And I love Dilly Fung's strength-based scholarship circle, where she talks, it's a little bit like that kind of original vision by Boyer, but she reframes it within a more disaggregated higher education view. And she talks about how we can support different types of teaching and learning through all these different areas, and that they don't have to be separated out. We can share and build on our different strengths based on our different contract types and our different contexts. And I think actually that's probably closer to what Karina and I argued for in Assembling Archaeology. We're talking about the need to integrate and share and be honest that our teaching informs our research as much as our research informs our teaching, and that for us as archaeologists, the practice that we do in the field is probably the place where those things intersect the most. So that is a short overview of what SoTL is, and I think this really matters for archaeology, right? Because to inform our teaching and learning, knowing that there's a whole load of SoTL out there that's been going on since 1990 is really great. I think I said at the start, I came to this really back to front. I knew what all the archaeological theories were, and I knew what people had done about teaching and learning in archaeology. But personally, I feel like I've been on a huge journey of learning about different types of pedagogic research. For Karina and I, learning about things like critical pedagogy has been really, really important and informing our work. Joyously, the kind of stuff that Karina and I have been proposing, the kind of assemblage theory led approach to teaching and learning. So we've called it inclusive teaching assemblages, or inclusive learning assemblages, we've called them. There's other people doing that kind of work, including a really fantastic book by a lady called Karen Gravett, which is called Relational Pedagogies. Or why we didn't think of that brilliant title, I do not know, but excellent stuff. So that stuff is going on. And there's loads of different SoTL journals, SoTL organisations that we can draw on and be part of. So as archaeologists, we can enrich our teaching practice if we engage with that community of people who are doing SoTL. But also, I think, as Karina and I have argued in our book, we need to theorise for our own subject needs. So much of SoTL is very classroom based, but these are just pictures, a few pictures from the different ways that I have taught and learnt myself over the last couple of years. So we teach in labs, and we teach in fields, and we teach in virtual contexts, and we teach by in all sorts of different ways, carrying heavy turfs and bailing out trenches are just as much part of our teaching as teaching people how to trowel and how to draw and how to analyze artifacts in a lab. And that means that the SoTL that's out there, it doesn't quite fit our needs. We need to sort of to think about our own scholarship of teaching and learning, I think, so that we can really fit it to our needs. And in doing that, that's where we can really give back to the field of SoTL. So I think there's a lovely circle here. We can gain lots from engaging with that work, but also we can enrich that work by taking the narratives of teaching and learning outside of the very sort of static view of the classroom that I found permeates a lot of the SoTL that I've read. So that is a kind of review of, let me stop sharing my screen for a second. That's my super fast, well, it wasn't really that fast. I'm going to pause the record, just record this last part. So these are the different SoTL organisations and journals that you might be interested in reaching out to. And it's fantastic that in the chat we've got the one in anthropology. So we obviously do have sort of subject specific ones. And there is an archaeology one that is based in the US, although I think it looks less at teaching and learning in higher education and more broadly teaching and learning. Whereas most of these, I think, are dedicated to higher education specifically. And so I thought it would be useful to wrap up by just talking a little bit about a couple of the kind of themes that people are talking about. So interestingly, SoTL have set this big set of grand challenges for SoTL, which just came out in the autumn in time for the conference. And they're setting out these kind of things that they think maybe we should really sort of frame our SoTL inquiry around. So they've got things like how to develop critical and creative thinkers, how to encourage students to be engaged in learning, the complex processes of learning, how identities affect both teaching and learning, and the practice, use and growth of SoTL. But I think there's probably some gaps here. These are the headlines, but they've got lots of detail about each of these on their website. But I think there are some gaps here. I think things like sustainability, I think things like the way our teaching and learning articulates with global sustainability goals is probably something that is an equal challenge for us to address through our SoTL, and perhaps that picks up on some of their grand challenges. But I think there's more, and I think that's something that, again, like as archaeologists, this is what we can contribute back, because we're thinking about those kind of things. And so finally, I thought I'd just finish off with a couple of SoTL top tips that I've picked up from other people, and I thought I'd share here. This is really me just passing on what other people have passed on to me. I think the really interesting thing is the whole need to define terms. I think the thing that I really learned in the International Collaborative Writing Group is that we all sat down and there was people there from Australia, Canada, America, the UK, and colleagues who'd also come from a a Bengali and then Malaysian teaching and learning background as well. And we all started talking about our experiences of higher education, and none of us had the same terms. You know, obviously in America, there's the use of the term faculty to mean colleagues who do teaching and learning and work in the university, whereas in the UK and in Canada and in Australia, we use the word faculty to denote an organisational unit that is part of the university, and those kind of things can cause real sort of cross meanings. So if you're writing for any of those kind of journals, it's definitely worth defining your terms, because we don't have that kind of international similarities. One of the things that I'm working on at the University of Manchester, and that is a really interesting issue, is kind of ethics requirements. Obviously, most universities have an ethics panel now, and a requirement that if you're doing some research, you need to get that kind of ethical approval. But sometimes scholarship of teaching and learning and pedagogic research, any kind of research into teaching and learning, that's it might be different at other institutions, but I'm certainly finding that colleagues that I'm talking to, and particularly in my context, getting this kind of teaching and learning based ethical approval is quite complicated, because people have really been thinking about you know, different types of research within all the different departments, and they haven't necessarily thought about either students or teachers as part of those kind of ethical requirements. So there's some really interesting conversations to be had around that. I think one of the other things is to form a local community of practice. If you sort of feel like you're on your own doing this stuff, the chances are you probably aren't, particularly if you're in the UK context. There's probably lots of teaching and scholarship colleagues across the university, or teaching focus colleagues, who are all rattling around the only person that they are in their department. I didn't meet another teaching and scholarship colleague until I was a professor, which is insane, isn't it? Like at the University of Manchester, I was sort of rattling around on my own, or that's not true. My head of school said, "Oh, I think there's only 3 of you in the school," and then later on I found out that there was 40 of us on the same contract in my school. So so there's probably is people wanting to form those kind of local communities of practice. And I've heard a number of people say, always get a bog off, always get a buy one get one free from your, I'm sure this is the same for all research, but for anyone who's doing teaching, you know, what can you do that can enhance your teaching, and also that you can put out there for evaluation to advance teaching and learning in the same way as sort of was advocated by some of those kind of original SoTL names. You know, what can you do that not only is going to advance what's happening in your classroom, but might enhance what's happening in that kind of broader context that you're in your organizational unit, in your whole university, beyond into the archaeological community. So if you're doing a bit of work, see what else you can get out of that work. For a couple of years, I've been running a series of reflective practice seminars, and now we're evaluating those to do a broader piece of research about what reflective practice seminars can bring in a research intensive university context. You know, so it's that kind of sort of bog offy kind of thing is really useful. And as we mentioned before, presenting at international fora such as these roundtables is a form of scholarship of teaching and learning. It's a form of dissemination and getting your work out there for critical analysis. And we are always looking for people to run sessions and talk in sessions. So if you're doing some stuff and you want to present it, and you've got some new ideas that you're rolling around, then just give us a shout, because we would be really happy to have you at one of these roundtable forums. And the very last thing I should say, and this is just me being really terribly biased, if you're in the UK and you're teaching focused, we have a UK national teaching focused network. I have found such lovely people in this network. We are running we're really focused around things like creating communities, looking at reward and recognition for learning and teaching focused colleagues. So we've got an in-person session in Nottingham on the 23rd of April at the Association of National Teaching Fellows Conference, which is open to everyone. And then most of our events are online. They very much follow this roundtable model, and you may find the website looks really similar as well. And that's because I've made it. But this is a really nice community in the UK, and a really good way of finding people if you want to collaborate, if you want to find people to do interdisciplinary SoTL and things like that. This is a place to sort of reach out and things. So I will stop. That is my last shameless plug. I will stop that, and that brings us neatly to 3 minutes off the end. Does anyone have any questions or want to say anything or anything like that? And I will put the link to the National Teaching and Learning Network in the chat as well. Oh,
I think it's quite exciting to see there is so much happening.
it's really nice to, like, I think Karina and I think you can probably back me up, but I think we felt like we were just rattling around on our own, going, oh, why are people doing this? And
actually people actively trying to discourage you from following it, like well-meaning people, but we're like, you know, if you want to think about your careers, you don't want to go down this route. But
yeah, and I think that's one of the things, you know, like if you look at Wonky in the UK, that's the like a kind of weekly bulletin about higher education. There's just been a paper, a blog the other week about people in business studies choosing teaching and learning as a kind of as a vocation, and really sort of following it in higher education. And it was so lovely to read that kind of thing. That is the, I think, the upshot of the kind of disaggregation of HE is that actually people are in these roles and following them and things. So anyway, people are signing off. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. It's been really nice to chat and really nice to share. And feel free to come along and present anything you're doing here in the future. Just give us a shout.
Yeah, feedback form is going in the chat again.
Oh yeah.
Really welcome any suggestions for future topics, and indeed if you want to guest facilitate, you're more than welcome to, so just let us know.
Are there any more of these scheduled for the rest of this academic year?
Oh yeah, we've got one planned, but we haven't got a date for it, and it's going to be Gabe Mashenska shared his he's got this new book about teaching and learning, and he's going to be doing a session that's based
oh, that'd be brilliant. I look forward to that. I really like his work.
Yeah, I'm very excited.
On African teaching and learning.
That's going to happen, and we're running a session at the SAAs. Anyone who is there in person, it will be on the Friday morning. We think, we haven't seen the final program, but it looks like it's Friday the 19th.
We've got John Schofield in there.
John Schofield is the 1st of October. He's going to be talking about his new book as well.
I'll be at the SAA next month too. I have a session on Thursday night. It's not about this, but if you want to hear about gender in archaeology, we're the Women in Archaeology Interest Group. Our big, enormous session is Thursday evening from like 6 to 10. We have a bunch of really great papers, 3 really great discussions. I'm excited about that. So I'll be there. So hopefully we'll see you there too.
List.
I'm sorry?
You share details on the GISC list on our
yeah, we just sent to the listserv, right?
Yeah.
For that?
Yeah.
Great. We're just putting together like a little Women in Archaeology Interest Group flyer with a bunch of papers and resources. So I'll share that to the list. Or if I can't figure it out, I'll share it to one of you and you can put it out there. But yeah.
Have something on the Friday evening. So we'll keep you posted if you.
Yeah, share that. I'd love to see you all in person. That would be fantastic.